Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're unpacking a really crucial and often quite heartbreaking area. It's about protecting vulnerable older people and individuals with intellectual disabilities in care settings.
Hmm.
Specifically, we're looking at this fascinating study that explored how incidents of physical abuse are actually judged. Judged by the officials who are meant to investigate them. It's kind of a look behind the curtain, a peek at the system designed to safeguard. And, well, what we found might genuinely surprise you.
It really might. And what's compelling here, I think, is just how significant this challenge is globally. I mean, physical abuse in institutional care, it's a pervasive social problem, and the consequences are severe for residents. We're talking pain, injury, depression, anxiety.
Yeah, those consequences are devastating.
And a major hurdle is that so many incidents probably go unreported. Residents might struggle to voice concerns, or maybe they fear they won't be believed.
That struggle to be believed, that feels like a massive hurdle right there.
Absolutely, which makes robust staff reporting and, crucially, thorough investigations just so critical for discovery and prevention.
Okay, so the study we're unpacking today, it zeroes in on Sweden's mandatory reporting system.
hmm
Was there something sort of unique about Sweden's approach here?
Well, Sweden is particularly interesting because they have these designated officials, often social workers, and they are legally required to investigate all reported mistreatment, every single one.
All of them. Ugly.
But here's the challenge. The Social Services Act, it has a remarkably vague definition of mistreatment and also seriousness.
Ah,
So it grants these officials considerable discretion, a lot of leeway, and only incidents they deem serious trigger further inquiry by regulatory bodies.
right, which really begs the question, what actually gets flagged as serious? How is that determined, especially when you're looking at, say, different types of abuse?
That's exactly what the study dug into. It analyzed reports of both staff-to-resident abuse and resident-to-resident abuse. And the finding is quite stark, really. Resident-to-resident abuse was actually more commonly reported.
More common. Wow.
Yeah, particularly in dementia care. And what's more, it often involved acts of pretty significant violence. We're talking beatings, strangleholds, even objects being thrown.
That sounds incredibly serious.
Yeah.
But
Hmm.
I sense there's a but coming.
There is, and here's the really striking discrepancy. Despite often involving these more severe acts, resident-to-resident abuse was rarely considered serious by the investigators.
Really? Compared to staff-to-resident abuse.
Exactly, compared to staff-to-resident incidents. And older people in dementia care, quite shockingly, were identified as the highest risk group for this type of abuse that wasn't getting flagged as serious.
So, okay, if the actual physical severity isn't driving these seriousness judgments, what is? Or maybe what isn't?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, like you said. The study found the physical severity itself wasn't the main determinant. They saw similar, quite severe incidents judged completely differently.
Can you give an example?
Sure. There was one case. A service user was pressed down in bed while the staff held a hand over her nose and mouth. That was deemed non-serious.
Non-serious. That sounds terrifying.
Right. But then, in other reports, lighter slaps were considered serious, so there's a clear inconsistency there.
Okay, so physical severity isn't the key. What about the victim's experience, like their fear, or if they got hurt? A broken hip, for instance.
You'd think that would be paramount, wouldn't you? But surprisingly, no. The victim's perception of harm, or even the extent of their actual injuries, fear, anxiety, even a hip fracture, these were not consistently used as primary criteria.
Even though the law requires it.
Even though the legislation requires considering the victim's experience, it's almost counterintuitive, isn't it? To sideline that direct human cost.
It really is. So if it's not the severity and it's not always the victim's harm, what is driving these judgments? What makes an investigator say this is serious versus this isn't?
The study points to two major factors, and they seem quite systemic. First, it's about the perpetrator's perceived intent.
Intent. How does that play out?
Well, especially in that resident-to-resident abuse within dementia care, the aggression was often explained away. It was framed as a symptom of dementia or just part of the disease.
Ah, I see. So the capacity for intent was seen as diminished or absent?
Precisely. And this framing, which basically says the motivation to harm isn't there, it led to a kind of normalization of violence. Less intervention followed.
That's chilling. The violence gets excused because it's seen as part of a condition, effectively ignoring the impact on the person being harmed.
Exactly. And the second factor, which was actually the most significant driver, was organizational issues.
Organizational issues, like staffing levels or procedures.
Yes, things like that. Reports judged as serious consistently highlighted organizational failures, things like lack of leadership, a long-lasting destructive culture, poor or missing documentation, maybe incompetent staff. These systemic problems.
Okay, and the non-serious ones.
The non-serious reports often downplayed or completely omitted these organizational issues, even if the details suggested they were present.
So let me get this straight. The investigators seem more focused on whether the organization failed rather than the specifics of the abuse or how badly the victim suffered.
That's what the analysis strongly suggests. The judgments seem primarily guided by these structural problems, these organizational shortcomings.
Wow. So effectively, the reason behind the abuse or the system's own failings overshadowed the actual harm done to the individual in deciding seriousness. That's quite a disconnect for a system meant to protect.
It's a profound disconnect.
So what does this mean for the bigger picture? For actually safeguarding these vulnerable people?
Well, if we connect this to that bigger picture, it really highlights a fundamental challenge, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What happens when the very system designed to protect ends up prioritizing, maybe unintentionally, organizational flaws over the direct harm experienced by the victim?
Yeah.
This study strongly suggests that truly safeguarding people is going to require more training for investigators, specifically in assessing violence itself, and perhaps most critically, a much greater emphasis on actually listening to the voices of service users and their advocates, hearing their experiences.
Putting the victim's experience back at the center where it arguably should always have been.
Exactly. It's definitely something for all of us, especially those involved in care, to mull over.